In these last two videos, I'm going to be explaining how immigration can be used to improve aggregate supply and how it can be used in order to achieve each of the economic goals, and then some links to material and non-material living standards. I'll do it over two videos because there's quite a lot of information. So first of all, in terms of immigration, its impact on aggregate supply, there's sort of key things that you want to be touching on in how immigration can boost aggregate supply or aggregate supply potential. First of all, it helps to offset the negative implications of a declining labour force by increasing our access to labour. It places downward pressure on wages because it gives more competition for jobs. It also helps to create employment opportunities because of those lower wage pressures. Businesses are more likely to employ people, so that can lead to lower prices, reduced wage pressures, increased productivity. Not only is there increased productivity because there's more competition for jobs, but the idea of skilled migration is to bring talented entrepreneurial people to Australia, which also boosts our productivity as well. Other things you want to talk about is how it alleviates capacity constraints and skill shortages because they've basically got access to a greater pool of labour. And it also helps to create economies of scale. And what I mean by that is because immigration also makes the size of our population bigger, by increasing demand, it allows businesses to produce in bulk and therefore benefits from the cost savings from doing that, or the fact that they can spread their fixed costs over a greater level of output. So key things: boosting participation, reducing real unit labour costs for businesses, increasing productivity for those two reasons, alleviating skill shortages or capacity constraints, and making businesses more willing and able to supply. You can also use that concept of increasing the quantity and quality of our productive resources here as well. In terms of strong and sustainable growth, a lot of the links are the same. It's basically trying to expand the supply side of our economy and speed up our long-term sustainable growth going forward. So it does that by reducing skill shortages in the economy so that demand can be met without inflationary pressures, by increasing the size of the pool of labour. Average immigration age is around 30%, so immigration helps to boost participation rates, and you can make links to reducing wage costs, helps to increase productivity, increases our international competitiveness. Whenever we're more internationally competitive, that creates jobs as well. Again, by maintaining productivity levels, downward pressure on wages, negates some of the demand inflation impacts that can occur in the economy. So it boosts employment levels and output in the long term, and that all stems from us being more internationally competitive and having lower prices and therefore increased demand for goods and services. It can ensure economies of scale because the larger size of our economy allows us to produce in bulk. Skilled migrants, it's also really important that you're not ignoring the fact that skilled migrants often come with select skills and select knowledge of the market as well. So the fact that they come here, that they're productive, they're good at what they do, that helps us to gain a competitive advantage as well, because they may be more productive in a sense than our workers as well. It also helps us to engage in world's best practice, because some of these migrants will have ideas on best ways to go about doing things, which will boost productivity as well. So they're all key things you want to be touching on. Boosting productivity, increasing the size of our labour force, which boosts productivity, which keep wages down, giving us access to new skills, new ideas, new knowledge of world markets, improving our international competitiveness, which helps to create employment going forward in the long term. There are no negatives for growth of immigration. It may lead to less GDP per capita, but in terms of overall growth levels, they should be higher. In terms of low inflation, it really depends on whether the supply side benefits outweigh the demand. Effective skilled migration the increase in aggregate supply should outweigh any demand pull inflationary pressures, but it's also important not to negate the fact or ignore the fact that there will be more demand for goods and services if we have more migrants here, and that can have some negative impacts on inflation. So in terms of benefits for low inflation, it expands our aggregate supply, keeps cost pressures down, helps to reduce skill shortages and wage pressures. It adds to the supply of skilled labour, so preventing wage pressures, reducing cost push inflation, increasing productivity because they know new techniques, they have new knowledge, they may bring about increased capital, so they may bring capital with them, and that will reduce unit costs and therefore contain inflationary pressures. So it's important to recognise that immigration can add to inflation in the short term if new residents don't add to the pool of labour. But if they do, we will get the benefits through a more skilled workforce, through a more productive workforce, which will help to expand aggregate supply and lower inflation. Finally, full employment. There is people that will say that these policies will hurt full employment. Some people will argue that migrants could steal our jobs, and that can lead to more structural unemployment. However, if our immigration policies are used effectively, it should put downward pressure on the unemployment rate. So it can lead to increased structural unemployment. And the other argument that people make is that even if some people, like the government will say, well, there's skill shortages in these areas and we'll target areas with skill shortages. But the other counter argument to that is, well, Australians might not have the skills now, and if we keep migrating people to Australia, then there's not the incentive for businesses to train workers up. So even though there's technically not people trained in those areas right now, and we do experience skill shortages, we'd be more likely to train up our own residents if there wasn't the opportunity to migrate, and therefore that could still lead to more structural unemployment in the long term because people don't get access to training. Skilled immigrants generally take jobs that are unfilled though, and that helps, and they also help to restrain growth in wages and costs, and therefore help to keep prices down and increase demand for goods and services, which creates employment in the long term. So the idea is that if we effectively target skilled migration in the right areas, that it should be in areas of legitimate skill shortages. You can also argue that migration boosts aggregate demand. So not only do prices go down because there's more productivity, but there's more people in the economy, so that can help create jobs as well. So any person that comes here may take an Australian job, potentially, but they're also going to spend money on goods and services and create additional jobs. So the increased aggregate demand is good for full employment, and the fact that they keep wage pressures down because it keeps jobs in Australia because we're internationally competitive. But there can be some increased structural unemployment in the short term. We'll look at external stability in the next one.